Welcome to Section 5, Two-Factor Authentication. In this section, we'll look at why two-factor authentication is so important. We'll look at how to do two-factor authentication using SMS-based authentication, and we'll also look at how to do two-factor authentication using Google Authenticator, which is a more secure option. We'll look at what two-factor authentication is and why it's so important. There are three possible factors that can be used to authenticate someone. Something that you know, something that you have, and something that you are. Something the user knows is what we started with. This means things like passwords or answers to security questions such as the user's date of birth. Incidentally, security questions are generally a pretty terrible idea. It's rarely difficult to guess someone's date of birth based on public information these days, and equally someone's favourite colour, something like that. You're really narrowing down the options relative to if you just ask the user to pick a password. Something the user has is a very common approach in physical security, where it could be a key to your house, but in the context, something the user has is a very common approach in physical security, where the key could be a physical key, such as the key to your house or office. In an online context, this is what we're going to use for two-factor authentication. So it could be access to a phone number or email account. It could be a private key that's used to sign messages. Really, the key is anything that you can use, anything that you can prove that you have can be used for authentication based on something you have. Something the user is doesn't tend to come into online security that much, although it's becoming very common on mobile devices in particular. So this is anything that the user cannot change about themselves. For example, their fingerprints or their facial appearance. As we discussed in the previous section, passwords are not a very secure approach to authentication. Users tend to reuse them between websites, and they can't be relied upon to create secure passwords. A good way to mitigate this is to use a second factor. By relying also on something the user has, it's much harder for them to accidentally use something insecure. It's important to always use two different factors, not one factor twice. Two passwords does not mean two-factor authentication because they're likely to both be vulnerable to the same kind of attack. I personally think that two things that the user has, such as access to an email address and access to a phone number, is probably a reasonable approach to two-factor authentication, provided they're sufficiently separate. Even if some of your users don't need this level of protection, you should always consider whether activists in countries with hostile governments might want to use your services. And equally, ordinary people in hostile environments can be vulnerable. So it's really important to provide these most vulnerable users with options to secure themselves.